Dhe tani kam kënaqësinë që fjalën t'ia lë pikërisht profesorit Jason Thomas, të nderuarit tonë sot, i cili është një historian dhe lektor i shquar, ka dhënë mësim në historinë moderne dhe politikën në Universitetin e Oxfordit, Varshavës dhe Bostonit, është autor i veprës Balfour and Foreign Policy dhe ka kontribuar me mbi 50 artikuj në Oxford Dictionary of National Biography. Dr. Thomas është gjithashtu autor i biografisë së njohur King Zog, Self-Made Monarch of Albania, një studim themelor mbi historinë shqiptare të periudhës ndërmjet dy luftrave botërore. Ai paraqet edhe në dokumentarin biografik The Albanianada, Shqiptariada e Sir Noel Malcolm, realizuar nga ish ambasadori i Shqipërisë në Londër, zotit Mal Berisha. I nderuar profesor, fjala është për ju tani. Mirë se keni ardhur. Excuse me, if you want, you can talk by.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Well,
As you wish.
I will come here.
Thank you.
Hello, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak today as a British person. I apologize that I cannot speak to you in Albanian, though Aubrey Herbert was a far greater linguist than I am, but in fact I was quite surprised to discover he didn't speak very much Albanian either. He spoke to Albanians in Turkish, which says something about the nature of Albania at that time. Aubrey Herbert cared passionately about Albania. However, it must be said that most British people in 1912 did not care about Albania. I am British, I can say what might be rudeness if others said it. That there was a huge level of ignorance and indifference to the country. Most people barely knew the Albanian people existed. Herbert himself found that many British people confused Albanians with Armenians. And of course, even today, there are some people who make the same mistake. When he took up the cause of Albanian independence, therefore, he faced a very difficult task in engaging British people's interest. And not only the British people, but also the British government. Looked at in one light, Britain had no particular reason to oppose Albanian independence. On the other hand, it had no particular reason to support it. He tried to create a pressure group to encourage British support for the nascent Albanian state. This was the Albanian Committee, which he founded at a public meeting in central London on the 17th of December 1912, the first day of the Conference of Ambassadors. The meeting was held at the Hotel Metropole. If any of you go to London, you'll see it's just near Trafalgar Square. It is a big hotel, nowadays called the Hotel Corinthia. A public meeting was held, resolutions were passed in favor of Albanian independence. A report of the meeting was sent to 20 British newspapers. Not one newspaper published it. So the committee had to pay to have the report printed as an advertisement in the Times newspaper. In trying to build a pressure group to support Albania, Aubrey Herbert had to cast the net wide. He had to try to appeal to many different people. This, however, created a difficult situation. He did recruit 60 or 70 people to support the Albanian Committee, and it looked reasonably impressive on paper. There were 12 members of Parliament, 2 lords, but many of these people had no previous connection to Albania, and when one looked more closely at them, they were not so much supporters of Albania as opponents of the Balkan League, of Serbia, Greece, Montenegro, Bulgaria, opponents of them for many different reasons. Many of the supporters of the Albanian Committee were really pro-Turkish people who, when the Turkish Empire collapsed announced in October, November 1912, then looked to support Albania as a substitute. In some ways, this was even true of Aubrey Herbert. He was someone who greatly loved Turkey as well as Albania, and he had been a great enthusiast for the Young Turk Revolution of 1908. At the time, many Albanians supported it as well. But he was rather slower than many Albanians to turn against the Young Turks. Some of these people in the Albanian committee were also committed to the Albanian cause because they were Muslims. Two leading members of the committee were in fact Indian people from the British Empire in India who were supporting co-religionists, in effect. Also, many British imperial officials supported the Albanian cause because they thought that by seeming to support Muslims, they would please Muslims in British India, even though they didn't know a great deal about Albania. It surprised me to discover that about 1/10 of the membership of the Albanian committee were leading British Jews. Given that there were very few Jewish people in Albania, I thought, why? It turns out that in that case, they were not really concerned about Albania. They were concerned about the large Jewish community in Thessaloniki and the fact that if, under Christian rule in Macedonia, there would be discriminatory laws against them. So a different interest group there. Some other members of the committee were people who were just anti-Russian. Some of them were in the long British tradition of opposing the spread of Russian influence southward, as if Russia had influence in the Mediterranean, it could affect British sea routes to the empire in India and Australia. So some of these people were right-wing imperialists. Others were anti-Russian because they were socialists and hated Tsarist autocracy. With so many people from different backgrounds, Aubrey Herbert had a very difficult task in trying to keep this pressure group united. In fact, he decided it was not worth trying to keep it united, and separate groups are set up. A Macedonian committee was founded by the Jewish members. Aubrey Herbert himself, as well as being president of the Albanian committee, became chairman of a separate Ottoman association to support the Turkish cause. Was the Albanian committee effective? To be very blunt about it, I think as a committee it was not very effective because it had so many different aims and so many different interests. Having a few supporters all across the political spectrum, from right-wing imperialists to socialists, meant there was no concentration of support for Albania. British policy towards Albania in 1912-13 really had as its priority just keeping peace between Austria and Russia. That said, the Albanian committee did begin to increase awareness of the Albanian people in Britain. It did begin to get some knowledge of Albania spread through British newspapers at a time when there were no Albanian diplomats to speak in England. As has already been mentioned, the committee gave an audience to those Albanian delegates who came to London. Mehmet Konica, who became a particularly close collaborator of Aubrey Herbert, also Ismail Kemal Vlora and Isa Baletin. Aubrey Herbert did invite them to meet leading British politicians. He also arranged their entertainment and took them on a visit to London Zoo, where Isa Baletin said there were too many cages. "I like freedom," he said. In truth, it was not so much the Albanian committee that advanced the Albanian cause, it was Aubrey Herbert himself. He as an individual, I think, was more important than all the organization put together. It is commonly said that Herbert was a diplomat and a politician. That is true. I think, though, there is a danger of creating a misleading impression that he was only ever a very, very junior diplomat. He had the lowest possible rung on the diplomatic ladder for 2 years, and he was in Japan and he was in Turkey. As a politician, he was never a powerful figure. He was a member of parliament for 12 years, but he was what we call a backbench member of parliament. He sat at the back in the chamber of the House of Commons. He never came anywhere near being a government minister because he was not really a party politician. He was very much an individual who liked to speak his own mind and follow his own conscience, and did not say what his party wanted him to say. This is not the way to get promotion in parliamentary politics. Also, again, it must be said, he was seen in Britain as a rather odd person. Partly because he supported Albania when most British people were not interested. That was part of his odyssey. Also, he was someone who had a weak eyesight, so he tended not to recognize people, which made him seem rather remote. Half blind and wholly eccentric was one description of him. He also had a sense of humor and often encouraged people to laugh at himself. He was tall and stooped. He wore a monocle in his eye. He used his hands a lot when speaking. Also, he was someone with rather old-fashioned political views. It has been said he came from an aristocratic family. He didn't really like the modernization of British politics very much. He wanted British politics to be run by aristocratic gentlemen in a way that it was ceasing to be. Having said all that, he may never have been a maker of British policy, but he knew almost everyone who was. And I think what he brought to the Albanian cause was his remarkable range of social connections, that he was a person who, thanks to his class, to being the son of an earl, thanks to his educational background, he went to Eton College, the most prestigious school in the country. Never mind that he was bullied there and was not very happy, but he knew lots of people from that background. Yes, he then went to Oxford University and knew lots of people through that source. He may only have been in the diplomatic service for 2 years, but he had plenty of contacts there. He knew the people who mattered. He was a very close friend of Raymond Asquith, son of the Prime Minister in 1913. It was these personal connections that really gave him a way of spreading the Albanian message. Because not only did he know these people, but most of them, nearly all of them, really liked him. He was a very likable person by all accounts, a very sincere person, an honest person, a humorous. When the issue at stake was the future of Shkodra, then the biggest Albanian town, whether Shkodra should be Albanian or Montenegrin, and Herbert lobbied hard for this reason, on this point, and I think did manage to get something of his message across. Of course, Britain's decision was to keep the peace, to compromise between Austrian and Russian demands, that rather unhappy compromise that created a small Albania and left Kosovo under Serbian rule. But nevertheless, I think Herbert did get Grey to speak more generally, and Grey's most explicit statement, perhaps, was on the 7th of April 1913, when he said, "There is no reason why the same sympathy that was felt for Montenegro or other countries contending for liberty and national existence should not be extended to the Albanian population of Shkodra, and its district, who are mainly Catholic and Muslim, and who are contending for their lands, their religion, their language, and their lives." That was Sir Edward Grey in 1913. Aubrey Herbert referred to that statement many times afterwards, and perhaps rather slyly gave the impression that it would apply to all the Albanian lands, not just to Shkodra, to create the idea that Britain in 1913 had given a clear commitment to Albanian national self-determination. Beyond that, I suppose it should be mentioned, I think Aubrey Herbert practically alone persuaded the British government to give £5,000 to support starving refugees in Shkodra. That kind of emergency aid was almost entirely new in 1913. During the First World War, as has been said, Aubrey Herbert was in the army. He fought on many fronts and was also working as a British liaison intelligence officer. But even during the war, he tried to keep pressure on the British government to advance recognition of Albanian nationhood. Most of his efforts went into a scheme to try to create an Albanian brigade or regiment, which would be recruited from the Albanian diaspora to fight for the Allies. He talked to the War Office in London, he talked to the Foreign Office, he went to talk to the French government, to the Italian government. It was all a total waste of time, as many of you will know, because what Aubrey Herbert did not realise is that Britain, with the other allies in 1915, had signed the secret Treaty of London to persuade Italy to enter the war on the Allied side, and that treaty envisaged the partition of Albania between Italy, Greece, and Serbia. Such are the pressures of war and the expedients to which politicians are driven. When Aubrey Herbert learnt of the existence of the secret treaty, it was released to the world media by the Bolsheviks after the Russian Revolution. This became public knowledge in January 1918. It is then that he turned again to pressure group activity. He created a new body, the Anglo-Albanian Association. As he said himself, he thought that the Treaty of London was the 1915 treaty as a disgrace. Can any more flagrant violation of all our promises about the rights of small nations be imagined? This time around, he learned from his mistakes with the earlier Albanian committee. This was not a public body open to everyone with lots of different opinions. It was a smaller, focused group, which membership was by invitation. So it included more people who had direct experience of Albania, many of them, before and during the war. Again, there were 12 members of parliament and a couple of lords, but only 28 members. As has been mentioned, he also had the great support of Edith Durham, the famous English traveller in the Balkans. She, as Beytullah Destani said, wrote thousands of letters on behalf of the society and worked hard in all the secretarial and clerical side. In truth, this new Anglo-Albanian society was really a two-person group. As she herself said, and I think she was right, it was entirely run by Aubrey and me. He dictated the policy, I did the work. He, I think, was better suited by class, by background, by sex, by temperament to deal with person-to-person lobbying. Edith Durham was a great supporter and great worker for the cause, in some ways an even greater worker than Aubrey Herbert, in the sense that she was not a rich person and spent a lot of her own money on propaganda for supporting Albania, when Aubrey Herbert had the advantage of being very wealthy and therefore he didn't have to work. He could devote his time to political campaigning. On the other hand, I think temperamentally, he was much the better lobbyist. Edith Durham was a rather intolerant person, and very much, if people disagreed with her, she argued with them and got angry. Aubrey Herbert was very patient, very persevering, and humorous in his approach, which I think overcame to some degree that resistance that was found in the British Foreign Office. The British Foreign Office, at that time at any rate, did not like amateur policymakers. Indeed, I found in the archives of the Foreign Office's Balkan department the statement, Aubrey Herbert is a lunatic. They thought that he was too had too closely focused on just one issue. But in this new era of open diplomacy, as Professor Duca spoke, public opinion was becoming more important. Aubrey Herbert, in the period after the First World War, helped spread the idea that Albania was in the same category as Poland, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, as new nations based upon national self-determination, and that they should receive the same respect and treatment as these other new nations being created under the influence of President Wilson's new political ideas for international order. I think, again, if I were to pick one moment when Aubrey Herbert was important, I would say it was in the spring of 1920, when David Lloyd George, our Prime Minister, had switched the views round to again supporting a partition of Albania as a way of trying to get a peace agreement, an agreement on frontiers between Italy and Yugoslavia. This might have happened. The Americans had dropped out of the peace conference, so there was not so strong an emphasis on national self-determination. By asking lots of questions in Parliament, Aubrey Herbert and his few friends made it clear that the British government could not reverse its attitude to Albania and switch to a partition idea without being embarrassed. I think this partly sprang from the fact that Aubrey Herbert did not like the Prime Minister Lloyd George, and I think many of the members of Parliament who spoke up for Albania, some of them spoke not because they knew very much about Albania, but they did not like the Prime Minister and they wished to make life difficult for him. I think this did have some effect. Of course, a much greater effect was had by the Congress of Lushnja and the efforts of the Albanians to drive the Italians back to Vlora and out of the country. But I think the two things did work together. In conclusion, I would say, in this era of the early 20th century, there were many small groups which tried to influence British policy towards the Balkans. I've talked about the Albanian Committee and its successor, the Anglo-Albanian Society. There was also the Balkan Committee, which was pro-Balkan Christians, later pro-Bulgarian. There was the Ottoman Association, there was the Anglo-Hellenic League, which supported Greece, there was the Serbian Society of Great Britain. All these groups carried out campaigns, often squabbled a lot with each other, and sometimes did not make a very good impression on public opinion. It sometimes seemed that some British people took up a Balkan nationality and supported it like a football team, as a kind of sport for their own amusement. Aubrey Herbert, I think to a large extent, avoided that. He was someone with greater political insight. He was someone whose own loyalties were more complicated. He, as I say, was very pro-Turkish. He was also quite pro-Italian. This did sometimes mean that in supporting the Albanian cause, he put himself in quite a difficult situation. For example, he was not delighted by the Congress of Lushnja. At that time, Aubrey Herbert still thought that probably the best fate for Albania was to be an Italian protectorate. But once that Tirana government was created, and once it turned against Italy, he had the sense to realize that if Albania is to be independent, it must indeed decide its own policies, and he had the wisdom to step back. And although he continued to support Albania in the early 1920s, it was more in the nature of giving support to Mehmed Konica, the representative of the new Albanian government in London, not making himself, Aubrey Herbert, so prominent. He was aware of this. Aubrey Herbert once said, "Englishmen who take up foreign causes always throw themselves into these causes with complete fury and lose their judgment. I only am the exception." I think he was laughing at himself a bit, but only a little. Thank you.
Shumë e nderuar profesor Thompson, faleminderit për fjalën tuaj. Britanikët din gjithmonë të thonë gjërat me një humor pikant, stylish, shumë stylish, shumë faleminderit.